Hi folks, welcome back. Dennis Vitoza, also known as Noodles, and today we're going to be talking about something that happened yesterday at a video shoot, a debate shoot that I was present at here in Las Vegas. Now, as I mentioned a few videos ago, I'm in Las Vegas right now. I did the Brian Shapiro show on Monday. I've done a couple of other things that I can't talk about yet. And I'm doing a debate later today. In fact, that's what I'm currently getting ready to go do. But yesterday, and I can actually talk about this because the clip has now gone viral, I participated in a shoot with the UNF America tour. I'm censoring the name because we're still within the first 30 or so seconds to a minute on YouTube, and videos can get demonetized if I say the full thing. So just fill in the F for yourselves. I'm sure most of you are smart enough to figure that one out. Anyway, I was there for the shoot, and there were a few familiar faces, people I've met at different events, conferences, and even other debate shoots. Austin Off Script, whom I've debated on Jubilee, was there, as well as Jake Lang, who I met a few weeks ago and have talked to here and there. In fact, the last time Jake was in Los Angeles, I was actually in Chicago debating Adam Mockler, but some of our mutual friends got together and hung out. I just barely missed that. Anyway, there's a clip from this debate shoot that's been making the rounds online and has gone relatively viral. I've been seeing it pop up all over my X feed. The clip shows Austin Off Script and Jake Lang getting into an argument. Now, the full debate is available on both of their social media accounts as well as on the accounts of people producing the shoot like Z, and on the UNF America Tour page. It's about 7 minutes long, the whole thing. Now, for the sake of time, I've condensed it down to about 30 seconds, and I'm going to show that version here. If you want the full context, I absolutely recommend going to their accounts and watching the entire exchange there. I think that's the best way to understand everything that was said. Now, I've condensed it simply to save you some time, and if you end up wanting to see the full conversation, hopefully send a little traffic their way so they can get some viewership and you can understand what happened. Anyway, here's the clip.
What does it mean to be home? If I was born here, if my grandmother was born here, my daddy was born here, I got most of the fucking generations my family was born here.
Did you watch the BET Awards this year?
No, I didn't.
Did you celebrate
BET?
Molly Perkins?
You already. Why would we assimilate to a culture that saw us?
This guy's not a Republican. He cannot
Why
be
would we
on our
assimilate
side.
to a? Why would we assimilate to a culture that killed us? This is why white folks like you make
You think I'm a monkey?
Now, you may have noticed from watching that clip that I'm nowhere to be seen in it. I'm actually somewhere else. And there's a good reason for that. This confrontation happened after Jake debated one of the folks with the UNF America tour. Now, during that break, I stepped outside to grab a cup of coffee. And while I was out there, I ended up meeting a veteran. We had a long conversation about his story, some of the things happening in his life, immigration policy, and a number of other topics. He recognized me from one of my Jubilee videos. In fact, he stuck around afterward and chatted with some of the other folks, some of the other debaters as well. It was actually a really cool interaction. So anyway, all that being said, while this was unfolding inside, I was outside. I did hear some of it happening, but honestly, I thought they were just performing something. I had no idea what was actually going on until one of my friends eventually came outside while I was, still talking to the veteran and said, dude, you missed the whole thing. He had part of it filmed on his phone and showed it to me. I remember just looking and thinking, wow, I was genuinely blown away. A little while later, I walked back inside while they were resetting for another debate. Austin showed me the clip from his perspective, and afterward, I also spoke with Jake. Things had definitely gotten a little heated from what I was able to understand in that moment. Now, since then, today, obviously the next day, I've spent quite a bit of time thinking about what actually happened. I've watched the 2.5-minute version of what's been circulating online. To be completely honest, I haven't watched the full 7-minute exchange yet, but knowing both of these guys, knowing the room, being there the entire day, watching the dynamics play out at different moments, and considering the broader political environment and social media environment that we're currently living in, it's all had me thinking. The conversation actually continued later that evening. In fact, later in the evening, this topic and this situation came back up. A friend of mine had dinner with one of the other debaters, and we ended up talking at least tangentially about everything that had happened that day, including this confrontation. Now, all that being said, what I'm about to say isn't really news to anyone. I think most people have probably recognized some of this already, but I do think it's a conversation worth having because I think these are points that are important to reiterate in this culture that we're in. That interaction was really unfortunate. It genuinely saddened me to watch two people who are fundamentally basically on the same side politically end up in that kind of confrontation. They're both conservatives. To which extent they consider themselves aligned, I think that would be a conversation that they could have and clarify on their own. But I think it's evident that they're conservatives, but have different perspectives. Austin identifies himself as a Christian populist. Jake Lang is a conservative Republican. But despite those differences, they're broadly fighting for many of the same things. Where they can't seem to come together is how those goals should actually be pursued. And I think a lot of that comes down to methods and perspective. Jake is a provocateur. I don't think I have to tell many of you about any of that at this point. He's an expert at going viral. The things he does are intentionally provocative. They're highly controversial. They're understandably divisive, and they turn a lot of people off. Austin, on the other hand, doesn't fit the traditional profile of someone you would expect to see arguing for conservative values, especially inside these sorts of heavily left-wing spaces. He has deeply conservative values. He's a Christian. He's incredibly convicted in what he believes. I don't think he personally identifies as a Republican, but he's unquestionably conservative in many of his positions, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for him because of that. At the same time, I also understand where Jake is coming from when he does the kind of stuff that he does. I think this confrontation is symbolic of a much larger clash that's been developing inside the Republican Party over roughly the last year and a half, and I don't think it's going away anytime soon. I don't necessarily think it'll become a permanent schism in the party, but I do think it's become a wound, one that will eventually have to heal if Republicans want to be successful in 2028. And I say 28, not 26, because quite frankly, I think it's going to be very difficult for Republicans to perform well in the 2026 elections. Given everything the party is currently going through, the Republican Party is experiencing a genuine identity crisis. We've seen it play out in the Thomas Massie race. We've seen it play out in other races around the country, and I've talked about this numerous times on this channel. In my view, the identity crisis really began to reveal itself last December. AmFest was where it became impossible to ignore. That's where the underlying tension really became obvious. And what is that tension exactly? Well, it's two fundamentally different diagnoses of what is wrong with America, and consequently, two fundamentally different prescriptions for how to fix it. That's exactly what you see playing out between Austin and Jake. They're both on the political right. They're both trying to solve what they believe are serious problems facing this country, but they fundamentally disagree on what those problems actually are, what's causing them, and how we should go about solving them. And I honestly think they could probably get along. I think they could potentially work together. I think they could accomplish a lot together if they did. But I believe the biggest obstacle standing in the way is the reward structure created by social media and the pressure to constantly push the Overton window further in order to capture attention. If you look at Jake's behavior, for example, and I don't mean to be singling Jake out, but he's the clearest example because he's one of the loudest voices and goes viral all the time doing this kind of stuff. He's intentionally provocative. That's his style. But with that style, inevitably comes negative attention. He communicates his diagnoses and his prescriptions in ways that are deliberately provocative, and naturally, that's going to rub some people the wrong way, and that's exactly what we witnessed happen with Austin. Now, all that being said, Austin took issue with one of the central premises Jake was arguing from during his debate, which was that much of America's cultural decline is coming from the black community. Whether you agree with that premise or not, that's the framework Jake was arguing from. That's why he brought up the BET Awards. In fact, Jake was just in Los Angeles protesting the BET Awards, so this wasn't a new argument for him. It was a continuation of a message he's been communicating for some time across the country. Now look, if we're going to have an honest conversation about this topic, I do think there's a kernel of truth in part of what Jake is saying. But I also think that conversation requires a lot more context than social media usually allows. And this isn't an argument that's exclusively made by white conservatives or something unique to the political right. Similar criticisms have been made for decades by prominent figures within the black community itself. People like Ice Cube, for example, have argued that record labels have often rewarded and promoted music within the black community that glorifies crime, incarceration, gang culture, drug use, and self-destructive behavior. And look, if we're going to broaden that conversation, this isn't something unique to black culture either. You can make a very similar observation about Italian Americans. Some of the most recognizable depictions of Italians in American entertainment revolve around organized crime. Movies like The Godfather became cultural icons, but they also reinforced the stereotype that Italians are inherently connected to the mafia. They elevated the anti-hero, glorified violence, and turned criminals into legendary figures. That doesn't mean the films aren't masterpieces. They absolutely are, but they also shaped how millions of people viewed an entire ethnic group, as well as their understanding of crime itself. Media has enormous power to reinforce narratives, stereotypes, and cultural identities, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Now, that naturally raises a broader question. Why do societies so often reward these sorts of narratives that are divisive, sensationalized, or centered around violence? Well, if you want to go with the most popular stereotype cliche, it's because controversy sells. You'll find other people that argue that governments and powerful institutions have, at various points throughout history, attempted to influence public opinion for political purpose. We know as a matter of historical record that intelligence agencies, including the CIA, conducted covert influence operations during the Cold War. Declassified documents show programs like MKUltra, which involved unethical human experimentation without informed consent. We know about COINTELPRO, in which the FBI surveilled and disrupted political organizations inside the United States. We also know the CIA maintained relationships with journalists and media organizations during the Cold War, although the scope of what is commonly referred to, Operation Mockingbird, remains debated among historians. The broader point is that governments have, at times, engaged in information operations and psychological operations in pursuit of national security objectives. That isn't conspiracy theory, that's quite literally documented history. Now, once you accept that governments have historically attempted to shape narratives under certain circumstances, people naturally begin asking questions about culture itself. Why do some forms of media receive enormous financial backing while others don't? Why do certain messages seem to dominate popular culture? Different people arrive at different answers. Obviously, some believe it's simply market demand and market forces. Others believe institutions, both public and private, can reinforce cultural trends that ultimately serve political or economic means to an end, or ends, or interests. Now, to take this to the most extreme case, the crack epidemic is another example that's frequently discussed in these conversations. During the 1980s, crack cocaine devastated many low-income communities, particularly black neighborhoods. Decades later, reporting, including the work of journalist Gary Webb, raised allegations that individuals connected to U.S.-backed Contra groups trafficked cocaine into the United States. Subsequent government investigations found evidence that some Contra-linked traffickers operated while the CIA failed to fully report or act on what it knew, but they did not conclude that the CIA intentionally created or orchestrated the crack epidemic. Even so, the controversy permanently damaged public trust because many Americans came away believing that powerful institutions had either enabled or completely failed to prevent this enormous harm of the crack epidemic. Now look, let's backtrack a bit, because ultimately my point isn't to argue that every cultural problem is a result of some coordinated government operation. My point is that culture doesn't develop in a vacuum. Incentives matter, media matters, institutions matter, government actions matter, corporate decisions matter. All of these forces interact with one another, and understanding that broader context helps explain why two people like Austin and Jake can look at the exact same problems yet arrive at very different diagnoses about what's causing them. So in essence, all of this comes down to control, or more accurately, to competing explanations for why our culture looks the way it does today. Again, I'm saying all of this to illustrate that Austin and Jake are operating from two completely different diagnoses of the same problem. Austin, if you watch the clip, is communicating something much more personal. He's communicating the pain of growing up in this country, helping build it, his family helping build it, believing in it, and then feeling as though he's being excluded from sharing in his prosperity. That's how he interprets what Jake is saying. When Jake argues that much of America's cultural decline is rooted in black community, Austin hears that as placing the burden almost entirely on black Americans while overlooking the historical, institutional, cultural, and economic forces that may have contributed to many of these problems in the first place. And Jake, when he's communicating that, he's also communicating a deep frustration within many segments of the American community that our country is just being torn apart by the centrifugal force of multiculturalism. It's losing its identity, it's losing its standing in the global stage, and it's no longer looking like America because it is being torn apart culturally, politically, philosophically, in every way, shape, and form. So how do you reconcile these 2 points of view? How do you reconcile two people who are ultimately on the same side politically, but are fighting for conservative values, are fighting for Christian values? In fact, they're both pushing back against what they view as a progressive establishment that has weakened America's institutions and identity. Yet they can't even agree on the diagnosis of what they're both experiencing. They're looking at the same country through two entirely different lenses, and because they're seeing different root causes, they're inevitably arriving at different solutions. So to me, that's what made this confrontation so, I wouldn't say interesting to witness, but eye-opening to an extent. It wasn't just two people arguing. It was two completely different worldviews colliding in real time. Unfortunately, the way that collision played out was almost perfectly designed for social media. Instead of becoming a thoughtful conversation about competing ideas, it became reality show style politics. It became dramatic, it became theatrical, it became something designed to generate clips, reactions, reposts, quote tweets, and outrage. Personally, while I genuinely understand where both of them are coming from, and I think both of them sincerely care about the future of this nation, I don't think that kind of interaction is ultimately productive. I don't think it's conducive to bringing the country together, and I don't think it's conducive to building the kind of coalition that conservatives are going to need if we actually want to win elections and govern effectively over the next decade. Again, why does it play out this way? I feel like I have to keep bringing back this question because we have to understand that it's because of what social media rewards. Jake understands that better than almost anyone. He's a provocateur, as I mentioned earlier. He knows how to create moments that explode online. Austin is also somebody who's deeply principled and understands how these platforms work. Austin felt compelled to confront what he believed was a harmful premise. Jake, who never backs away from confrontation, responded in kind, and suddenly you have the perfect social media meltdown, crash out, showdown. Everyone picks a side, everyone clips the most dramatic moments, everyone reinforces their existing beliefs, and the algorithm rewards every second of it, every second of the division. The unfortunate part is that neither side really wins. Democrats immediately begin sharing the clips as evidence that Republicans are divided. Conservatives begin attacking one another. It reinforces the narrative that black conservatives and white conservatives can't work together. It creates the perception that the conservative movement is tearing itself apart from within. Whether that's actually true or not almost becomes secondary. Perception becomes reality online. And that's exactly the kind of division that we've been watching unfold throughout the Republican Party over the last year and a half. I've documented many examples of this on this channel. I've experienced some of it personally. I've received criticism from people inside my own party simply because I've chosen to speak out against foreign influence and argue that America's elected officials should prioritize American interests above every other country's interests. That issue alone has become a major source of division inside the conservative movement, as we talked about earlier this week. So when you step back and look at everything happening at once, these social media incentives, these internal party fights, this disagreement over race, this disagreement over foreign policy, this disagreement over identity, this disagreement over strategy, you begin to realize that the Republican Party is trying to answer a much bigger question. Who are we now? Because we're moving beyond the Trump era, folks. Whether people like hearing that or not, the Republican Party is entering a transitional period, and it is absolutely experiencing an identity crisis. I don't think that's even controversial to say anymore. Anyone who claims the Republican Party isn't going through an identity crisis simply isn't looking at what's happening objectively. There are multiple factions inside the party competing to define what conservatism looks like after Trump. And one of the problems I've noticed is that parts of the movement have started drifting toward an unhealthy team sports mentality. We've all seen this. I've seen it in debates like, the last Dean Withers Jubilee debate. There are moments where people, MAGA, are presented with direct evidence, even hearing recordings with their own ears of Trump saying some egregious things, and they still refuse to acknowledge what was said because admitting it would feel like helping the other side. And that's not healthy. But here's the thing. Donald Trump may have said things throughout his life that people find offensive or even gross. You can acknowledge that and still vote for him. Those aren't mutually exclusive positions. You don't have to pretend reality didn't happen in order to justify supporting someone politically. There are far stronger arguments you can make than simply denying facts that everyone can see. And by the way, I know I'm ragging a lot on my own party, but we also have to point out something. Democrats often just rely on immediately moving every political conversation into a moral argument. They try to occupy the moral high ground before discussing anything related to governance, that being competence, policy, or outcomes. Conservatives shouldn't fall into the trap of responding by pretending uncomfortable facts never happened. Instead, we should be willing to say, yes, this person is flawed, but I still believed they're the better choice. They're the better person for the job because of X, Y, Z. That's actually a much stronger argument to make. And in many ways, this idea isn't even foreign to Christianity. I mean, just look at King David. Scripture is remarkably honest about his failures. David committed serious sins. He arranged for Uriah to be sent to the front lines where he would be killed so David could marry Bathsheba. Those were profoundly immoral actions. Yet despite those sins, God still chose David for a greater purpose. David suffered the consequences for what he did, of course, but his moral failures didn't erase his ability to lead Israel. And by the way, the point isn't that morality doesn't matter. Of course it matters. The point is that moral imperfection alone doesn't automatically disqualify anyone. It doesn't automatically determine whether someone can govern effectively or not. If we're being intellectually honest, both political parties have elected deeply flawed and immoral individuals. On the Democrat side, Bill Clinton committed acts many people view as profoundly immoral. He was impeached for perjury. Barack Obama authorized drone campaigns that resulted in multiple civilian deaths. Every administration carries moral controversies of one kind or another. And I'm not saying that to excuse anyone. I'm saying it because politics often turns into a competition over who can appear morally superior instead of who can actually govern the country well. Those conversations almost always generate more virtue signaling than they do genuine solutions. Now, all that being said, I think it would benefit both parties if we simply acknowledged something obvious. When we elect public officials, we're not electing saints. We're not electing gods. We're hiring public servants. They're going to be flawed human beings. Now, obviously, there are limits. Some conduct should absolutely disqualify someone from holding office, and those conversations are worth having. Deep corruption, disqualifying. Felonies, crimes, disqualifying. That said, obsessively dissecting every aspect of someone's personal life simply to eliminate them politically often becomes counterproductive and ultimately weakens the country more than it strengthens it. We've seen that recently, not only with Donald Trump, but with situations like Graham Plattner, his Senate race over in Maine. Politics has increasingly become personal because personal attacks are often easier than debating policy. And I think that's something all of us, regardless of party, should recognize. Now, obviously, I'm not saying all this to justify more division, quite the opposite. My focus is to bring back to the central question. How do we bring unity back to this country? How do we transcend the level of polarization that we're experiencing right now? I think the first step is that we have to turn the temperature down. The rhetoric has become too heated. We need to start treating each other with a little more compassion, not just on the right, but from the right to the left and from the left to the right. We need to recognize that the overwhelming majority of Americans, regardless of where they fall politically, genuinely love this country. They may have very different ideas of how to improve it, but they still want what's best for it. If we begin with that assumption, instead of assuming the worst about everyone we disagree with, I think we'll have a much healthier political culture. Now, at the same time, I think social media has become one of the biggest dividers in this country. As long as the incentive structure remains what it is today, this kind of conflict will continue to be rewarded because people can build careers, audiences, and influence online from outrage. And to be absolutely clear, again, I'm not attacking anybody who was in that clip. I'm just looking at the ecosystem that we're all currently operating in. Everybody who exists in this current social media environment, you have to assume in good faith that they're communicating what they believe and they're doing what they think is the most effective to move their message forward in the environment that currently exists. The problem isn't necessarily the individuals. The problem is the infrastructure. It's the incentives. The algorithms reward outrage, conflict, tribalism, and emotional reactions far more than they reward thoughtful conversations, nuance, or attempts at finding common ground. Now, I also want to be clear about something else. I'm saying all this, but I'm also not calling for censorship. I'm a free speech absolutist. I don't believe social media companies should start deciding which political viewpoints people are allowed to express. It's not what I'm advocating for. What I'm saying is that these platforms should seriously think about the kinds of behaviors they're rewarding. There are ways to design algorithms that elevate higher quality conversations instead of constantly promoting the most inflammatory content imaginable. This isn't even a new discussion. People have been talking about these incentives since the early days of TikTok, when many people noticed that the version of the platform in the United States seemed overwhelmingly dominated by highly sexualized content, pranks, controversy, and entertainment, while reports suggested that educational and STEM-related content received far greater emphasis in China, in their version of the app in China. And what was interesting was that eventually TikTok itself acknowledged this and introduced features like the STEM feed on TikTok here in the United States, recognizing that educational content deserved greater visibility. The broader point is that platforms already make editorial decisions through their algorithms every single day. The question isn't whether algorithms influence behavior. They clearly do. The question is what kinds of behaviors we want them to encourage. Ultimately, this conversation is much bigger than one viral clip. It's much bigger than Jake Lang or Austin off script. It's about the direction of our politics and, frankly, the direction of our country. As activists, commentators, candidates, creators, and citizens who genuinely want America to succeed, I think we have a responsibility to lower the temperature. We need to have more real conversations. We need to spend more time listening to one another. And I want to make an important distinction here, because I know some people hear that and immediately think I'm talking about compromise. I'm actually not. I actually dislike the word compromise, because compromise often implies abandoning principles simply to meet in the middle. That's not what I'm advocating for. I'm saying we should remain principled while still being willing to work together. Those are two very different things. You don't have to surrender your convictions to have an honest conversation with someone who sees the world differently. You don't have to abandon your values in order to build coalitions around shared goals. Because look, at the end of the day, this isn't about stacking political wins. It's about preserving a winning country. If our politics becomes nothing more than endless internal warfare, everyone loses. We also need to recognize the real-world consequences of what's happening online. Over the last several months, I've lost count of how many people have told me that they no longer speak to members of their own family because of politics. I've heard it from conservatives whose families are mostly liberal. I've heard it from liberals whose families are mostly conservative. These aren't isolated stories anymore. They've become commonplace, and I don't think I have to tell you that's an incredibly unhealthy place for a country to be in. When conversation breaks down completely, history shows us that what often follows isn't good. Healthy societies require people to continue talking to each other, especially when they disagree. So I believe it's both our right and our responsibility as citizens who've inherited this country to seek conversation, seek understanding, put our egos aside, and stop allowing ourselves to be manipulated into viewing one another as enemies. We can disagree passionately, we can debate vigorously, we can stand firmly on our principles, but we should never lose sight of the fact that we're all Americans trying to leave behind a better country than the one we inherited. And if social media companies are willing to take some responsibility for the incentive structures they've created, I think that would also be a positive step as well. Anyway, folks, you tell me what you think in the comments down below. I'd love to hear your perspective. Make sure you like and subscribe. Hope you have a terrific day. Peace.